And it's lovely to welcome everybody today. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to start this session on teaching French phonics effectively. So I first learned about teaching phonics when I taught in a primary school from about 2006 for 3 or 4 years. And I used to go into the school and teach French from reception to year 6. And I was also watching the teachers teach English phonics, so the synthetic phonics methodology to reception year 1 and year 2. And it did occur to me then that teaching the rules of pronunciation to children would be a really effective and efficient way. I also noticed that teaching English phonics was actually very difficult because you can have several different ways to pronounce a particular letter string or letter. So for example, the O-U-G-H letter string in English could be pronounced ow as in bow, uff as in tough, oo as in through, o as in though. I think there's 7 different ways to pronounce just that one letter string. So English doesn't follow particular strict rules of pronunciation, which is why lots of children are actually dyslexic who are English as native speakers. And there's a lot less dyslexia, for example, with Spanish and Italian children because their language is almost 100% phonetic. French does have its issues with pronunciation, but it has much stricter rules. Its main sort of issues are around the silent letters. So it did occur to me then that teaching using the phonics methodology could be a really good way of teaching the pronunciation of a language. And at that time, I'd been taught to teach languages using the communicative methodology. I was trained in '96, and that was very much the teacher has to speak it all the time in the target language, and then eventually the students will sort of pick it up and learn it from there. And I think that's a great method if the children are based in the foreign country and they're hearing the language all the time. You have the more the immersion technique. But if you only see them 2 or 3 times a week, there just isn't enough time for them to get enough exposure to the language. So you actually need to teach the rules of pronunciation, just like we teach the rules of grammar. And so I started sort of developing some ideas using the English phonics methodology, and I developed those, taught them to year 3, 4, 5 and 6 in the primary school. Then I went back to teaching in a secondary school and focused particularly on year 7 and focusing on the key phonemes in teaching French in particular, but also Spanish and German as well. So that's a little bit of the background of teaching phonics, and we're going to go into much more depth now today, looking at what are phonemes and graphemes, how can we best teach them in French, and then in terms of planning a sort of model of progression, how would we plan for teaching French? And I'm assuming that you are secondary teachers, so we're going to be looking at how can we teach it in particular in year 7, and how can we perhaps reinforce it in later years. So thinking about the Key Stage 3 National Curriculum Programme of Study, which came into force in 2014, it's been around for a while. It's been there for 8 years, and it says that pupils should be taught to explore patterns and sounds of a language, and it suggests through songs and rhymes, and link the spelling, sound and the meaning of words. And actually that is another way of saying phonics methodology. It doesn't use that phrase, but that is exactly what teaching using phonics is. I'm not sure if you've read this Ofsted research review. I really highly recommend at least reading the front few pages, which is a sort of executive summary, even if you don't have the stomach for the whole review. But if not, at least read the sections, in particular looking at the 3 pillars of progression in languages, which are known as phonics, vocabulary and grammar. These 3 actually didn't appear for the first time in June 2021. They came about originally in the Teaching Schools Pedagogy, MFL Pedagogy Report, which appeared in 2016. And then this has sort of further reinforced this, and it's added a lot more pieces of research behind it. But it actually this time defines phonics as the system of sounds of a language and how they're represented in written words. It talks about clear and reliable pronunciation and the links between sounds and spelling being integral to learning a second language, a strong awareness of phonology, and the ability to decode words. And I put the link in there, but you can just Google the headline Ofsted MFL review of June 2021. I would say I've been involved in Ofsted inspections in the last year or so, and I would say that if you have a deep dive in languages with Ofsted, you will certainly be expected, or it will certainly come across very well if you can show that you understand this review and that your own MFL curriculum has been mapped to phonics, vocabulary and grammar. That would be seen as being really strong practice. They don't say that you have to do it because Ofsted are very careful not to say that, but essentially it was their own research review, and if you've read it and if you've used it, then it will go down very well, and I think your department would have a much stronger chance of coming across well, especially around curriculum intent. This review also talks about curriculum plans showing a clear logic behind progression in phonics, and we're going to look at that later in our session, and also planned practice and review of phonemes. So like anything, you wouldn't teach an item of grammar once and then just forget about it for months and weeks afterwards. You would review and practice that, possibly using the retrieval practice or the spaced learning methodology. So you leave a bit of time and then you go back when the students have started to forget it, to make sure that it embeds in long-term memory. And it talks about how curriculum plans should show how small differences in sound can unlock meaning for pupils as well. And then we had in January, just a few months ago, the new GCSE specifications for GCSEs. They're going to be examined in 2026. So it's our current Year 7 and Year 8 students to whom this applies. And it specifically talks about students learning and applying the principles by which spelling represents sounds. So this has now been sort of moving from being just in the National Curriculum Programme of Study in 2014 to being mentioned in the Teaching in Schools Pedagogy Report in 2016 to being part of Ofsted's MFL research review in 2021 to now actually being government policy. Now we are actually expected to teach using this methodology, and also students will be assessed in their GCSE exams on this methodology as well. So things have moved from sort of more suggestions to becoming really statutory. And as a result, part of this assessment is that students in their GCSE exams will undertake dictation of short spoken extracts with credit for accurate spelling. And this is them actually being tested on, can they make that sound spelling link? I don't know if any of you are as old as I am. I was the last year to do an O-level back in 1987. And we actually had dictation as part of our O-level exam. And so things have come full circle. I can't even count how many years it is, probably 35 years later or so, or it's going to be sort of nearly 40 years later by the time it's actually in place. But there we are. We always seem to see the same things in education, and here we are back again with dictation. But as you can imagine, dictation is a really good and accurate way of determining whether students can make the sound spelling link. Do they hear the words accurately? But also, do they know the vocabulary well enough to spell them properly? Because there are, for example, in French, a few occasions where you would have a particular sound like the en or an sound, en, which could be spelt in two different ways. And in some cases, it would have a silent T at the end, or maybe a silent S if it's a plural word. So there you do have to have more than just the phonics knowledge. You do have to have a sort of wider understanding of grammar, verb endings, vocabulary, and so on to be able to do dictation successfully. So first of all, I've got a question for you. It'd be great to have a little bit of interaction. If you'd like to put a suggested answer in the chat, that would be excellent. Any ideas about what a phoneme is? Well, I have a quick sip of my tea. It's actually lovely to see someone here. I've just noticed someone called Alison, who I actually did my PGCE with many, many years ago. So Alison will remember the fact that we were taught the communicative methodology at Sheffield University on our PGCE. I've just realised that I can't see the chat while I'm sharing with you. So I'm going to ask the next question. Can you give an example of a phoneme in English? Now, I gave you the example of, say, oo, the oo sound as in through. I only really sort of got to grips with phonics by actually watching them being taught in a primary classroom. And also when my own children were learning to read, I could see them using the phonics methodology to decode and work out words. But there's lots of examples in English. And we'll talk about the number of phonemes that there are in the English language in a minute. And can you give an example in French of a phoneme? And it's a nice idea maybe to think of the numbers 1 to 10, and can you think of, sound them out to yourself, can you think of any phonemes there? Okay, so these are the answers to those questions. A phoneme is the smallest single identifiable unit of sound. So it could be a single letter. So we've got some examples in English. We've got s, p, for example, m for part of mum. It could be 2 letters together like sh in English or wa in French. It could be a longer letter string like the OUGH, which is the written version of it is a grapheme. And as we said before, it could be pronounced in many different ways in English. You've got the EA, U sound in French, the O sound as well. So it shouldn't be confused with letters of the alphabet. And I would very strongly advise that you don't teach the alphabet anywhere near the time that you're teaching phonics, because it can be quite confusing for children. I would leave the alphabet right till the end of year 7 or into year 8, and I would really focus on phonics during year 7, because the alphabet can be taught at any time. It's the same in the English methodology at primary schools in England. There's a huge focus on phonics as soon as children arrive in reception, into reception year 1 and year 2, and they don't actually teach the traditional alphabet, A, B, C, D, and so on until well after children have grasped the rules of phonics. And what's meant by to segment? And a teacher might say to a child, you know, segment that word. You've come across a new word, segment it out. Have a go at segmenting the word shop. And it's essentially, you're segmenting it into its individual phonemes. So in English, that would be sh, o, p. So 3 different phonemes there. Helped you with that. Let's have a French word now. So following that same methodology, can you segment the word lapin in French? Let you have a think for a few seconds. How many phonemes does it have? If you're with a colleague, just tell them what you think. And it's 4 different phonemes, l, a, p, and then un. That in sound, that nasal sound, is a sound that we don't have in English, as you know. And then what's meant by to blend? And it's probably not rocket science. It means to draw the individual phonemes together to pronounce a word. And if you ever hear a child learning how to read, they see a new word they've not come across before, and at a very simple level, it might be the word cat, and they sound it out, cat, and then they try and squash those sounds together to make that word. And that's essentially what blending is. So those 2 phrases, segmenting and blending, are something that your year 7 students will be very familiar with from their time at primary school. And it's always good to build on the sort of vocabulary that they're used to. So things like phonemes, graphemes, blending, segmenting, you can use that as much as you like, and it will be good for them to make links with it when they learnt the English rules of pronunciation and spelling. So in English, there are 44 phonemes. We have quite a lot in our language. There are a few extra ones depending on what part of the country you're from. So in the Northeast, they have a couple of extra sounds that we don't have. In French, there are 36. And in, for example, another language like Spanish, there are 25. Italian is similar. So a much more phonetic, simpler language in terms of pronunciation. So French is sort of about midway in terms of levels of difficulty as a language, and English is one of the most difficult in terms of the number and difficulty of phonemes. Now, I think one of the sort of easiest ways to see how challenging the rules of phonics can be is if you give your students some cognates. And as we know, I've put the word croissant in there because we would say croissant, wouldn't we? In English, we use that word quite a lot now. But if you sort of have a look at those, one activity you could do with your older students who you perhaps haven't used the rules of phonemes to teach with is to ask them to say these words out both in French and in English. And it's something that you can do as a way of starting to think about differences and similarities and which are the phonemes, which are the sounds in French that are very different when you compare English and French phonemes. So we could say agent, agent, euro, euro, chocolat, chocolate, prince, prince, and so on. We all know our students often get the word famille wrong in French, don't they? They often don't say the E sound, they say famille or something like that. And travail, they often get wrong as well. The AIL sound, they often don't say accurately. So it's a really good way of thinking and comparing which are the most difficult phonemes, which are the ones that we need to concentrate on. And equally, there are some that are identical when you compare French and English. So you've got the P sound of police and police. You've got the M sound of mum in English, mère in French. It's identical. So you don't need to focus on those, and they're quite often consonants. So I would suggest you don't need to teach all 36 phonemes. You only need to teach those which are going to have a level of difficulty for young people. Let's have a think about which phonemes should we be teaching. So the DFE has very helpfully listed in its French subject content all the phonemes that it thinks that we ought to teach, and I completely agree, these are the difficult phonemes. We've in particular got the silent final consonant in French, which could be consonants such as S, T, X, Z, and so on. So that's a rule of pronunciation rather than a particular phoneme. But you can see here probably nothing is a surprise. We've got the nasal sounds, the the on, the sound. We've got the E's with accents going and e. We've got the wa sound. We've got the soft CH sound, the sh sound in French, whereas the CH sound in English can be pronounced in different ways. It could be pronounced as a ch sound, as in church, which we're probably most familiar with, but it could also be a soft sh sound as well. And one activity I do with students when I'm teaching the CH sound in French, the sh sound, is I might say, what words can you think of in English where CH is pronounced sh? And I think particularly in year sevens, you'll find it quite sensitive to sound, because I've thought about it a lot at primary school. When I've done this with year 7, they've said words like chandelier, machine, chalet, champagne, chardonnay, things like that. And they are all words that originally came from French. Chef is another one. So that is a nice way of talking about how the reason why English is a bit of a mishmash of different ways of pronouncing different graphemes is because we've been influenced by the William the Conqueror conquering England in 1066, which meant the upper classes spoke French for 200 years. So that brought a lot of French into our language. We've got the Anglo-Saxon influence as well. Whereas French hasn't had such influences from other sort of occupations. And so it does tend to keep its rules quite strict, which is really useful for us teaching it. So these are the suggested phonemes. As I said, we don't need to teach every sound. We've thought about which are the most difficult for our English learners. And I would say these are, I think, your nasal sounds, your ch sound, wa, are often mispronounced. Your j, your soft j, which is in that very high frequency word, je. We don't want them to say je. And then obviously our rules of silent letters and liaison. So how could we teach them effectively? So I'm going to show you a resource that I developed back in around 2012, 2013, which certainly for quite a while was used by many schools. And it takes the difficult phonemes, the ones that are very different from French, and it makes them into an imaginary planet. So when we focus on a particular phoneme, we are going to visit, for example, la planète wa, or la planète I, or la planète que, that QU sound, which is often mispronounced as well. So it's just a sort of fun and imaginary way to access particular phonemes. What we would do first of all is each of the planet activities is a short slot that lasts about probably 10 to 15 minutes in a lesson. It's important to revise and review previous phonemes that have been taught and looked at as part of the retrieval practice activity. So in this particular case, the phoneme that we're going to look at comes in a series. I think it's about number 7 or 8. And so we're going to review the un sound, the on sound, and the e sound that have already been covered. And we ask the students to try and pronounce these individual words and phrases. And then we're going to go and visit our planet.
Can you think of any words with the wa sound in?
So we ask students to think of any words, and what I tend to say, especially if I'm in a French classroom with lots of posters around with lots of words in French, is shut your eyes or put your head on the desk and just think of sounds. And I say, think of things like numbers 1 to 10, maybe think of animals, greetings, whatever it is that they already know. Now, if you're lucky enough to be teaching children who come into year 7 who say all learned French, and you're teaching them French, you could start pretty much straight away, and it would be a great way to revise some language. What tends to happen is we have a very mixed group with children who've had lots of different language experiences. So I would wait a few weeks before starting this, because they need to have some language to hook, some knowledge of language to hook this sort of learning onto. Just as when children arrive at primary school in age 4 and start to have the English phonics teaching, they already have a wide vocabulary in English. They've learned to speak and they can say words, they know words. So when we do this in French, I would suggest 4 or 5 weeks, or leaving it until the end of the first half term, perhaps teaching it from about the end of October onwards. So ask the students to just think of the words that they know. So if we think of animals, greetings, numbers, we might think of words like toi, oiseau, poisson. If we've done colours, they might say noir. If we've done greetings, they might say au revoir or bonsoir, perhaps. So I would ask them to put their hands up, give me some words. I would write the words on the board, and I would draw a square around the focus grapheme. Obviously, the grapheme is the written representation of the phoneme. This is important if there's more than one way to write that particular sound. So it is the case with the O sound in French. It could be AU as in jaune, EAU as in beau. It could be just an open O sound as well, or as in Octobre. So there's different ways to write a particular grapheme, phoneme, and that's important to write that down and show that. And then we're going to go and visit the planet, in this case, la planète Wa. Obviously, we need to make sure they know it's not a real planet. It's an imaginary planet. Once I taught this in year 6 and the children thought it was a real planet, I think they went home and told their parents about that. So just make sure they know it's a made-up planet.
La planète Wa.
So we go and visit la planète Wa, and then we go and see everything on this planet has only got the Wa sound in. So let's go and see what we're going to find on this planet.
3. Croissant.
Noir,
Poisson. Oiseau.
And you can do something like, if they said a word that appears, you could give them a merit point or something like that to sort of incentivize some good answers. And then we're going to do a really simple listening activity. And in the resource that I created, there's lots of different types of listening activities. This is one of the ones that it's most simple. This is where the students just listen to 2 words and they just have to decide which word has the wa sound in. Is it the first word or is it the second word? And you can just get them to hold up one or two fingers if you want. And that is a micro listening activity at its most simple. And actually, before we can actually get on to listening out for full words, to develop even good vocabulary knowledge in learning a new language, we need to go right down to the micro activity, which is listening for a particular phoneme. And it means that over time, students then work out every time they hear something with wa in, they know it must be spelled OI, and that then develops and broadens their vocabulary knowledge. So I'll just show you a couple of examples of what this sounds like.
La Côte d'Ivoire, le Cameroun,
So we've just listened to it. Was it the first or the second? La Côte d'Ivoire, le Cameroun. We're going to listen and read this time.
la Côte d'Ivoire, le Cameroun,
And it doesn't matter that the students don't know these words. It's actually better that they don't, because they're not listening for meaning, they're listening for sound. And it's a bit like when you're new to learning a language, or if you went and lived abroad for a while, everything all probably sounded like lots of noise to begin with, and bit by bit you tuned your ears in. And one of the ways you tune your ears into a language is by listening for and identifying particular sounds in words that you probably don't know.
Marie-France, François, Marie-France,
and so on. And then we would give the students a rhyme that they would have a go at saying in pairs.
Une oie, deux oies, trois oies, quatre oies, cinq oies, six oies, sept oies, sept oies.
It's a good idea to practice this a few times. This is a real French rhyme about geese, and it's a little bit of a play on words at the end where they say c'est toi or c'est toi. And then sometimes they have something in addition. Often this could be a tongue twister, a bit like this one.
Il était une fois un homme de foi.
And that's a really famous tongue twister. It's a bit like she sells on the seashore. I would ask probably more able students to say the whole thing, to practice it and say it, and maybe less able just to say one of the sentences. And the ways that the listening activity can get harder is that the students, as they get more used to the phonemes, is that they then have to do a tally. They might hear a little song or a rhyme, and they have to do a tally of the number of times that they hear a particular sound. And when I started using this technique, I found that the students were not very good at it the first 3 or 4 weeks, but they got better and better. And by the end of the year, they were very good at identifying sounds and also being able to read words that they've not come across before accurately. And that is the final little activity in this series, where they're given a series of words that have got the focus phoneme in, sometimes with other ones. So they previously learned the on sound, so this one's got boisson as well. It's also got victoire because they've learned the E sound. They would have a go at practicing it in pairs very quickly for 10-15 seconds, and then have a listen to the correct answers.
Moi, toi, boisson, victoire, soir, joie.
And that's obviously the test. One of the tests is, can you listen and pronounce correctly? And obviously dictation is another test. Perhaps you can then add in some simple sentences as they build up the number of phonemes that they learn. I would suggest some simple dictation activities. So we do know that we need to make sure we have planned practice and review of phonemes, just as we would with, say, grammar and vocab. And we also need to make sure that we assess phonics knowledge. And I would suggest for younger learners in year 7 and 8, when you've been teaching some phonics, you could give them some assessment activities like this. They could even be part of the activities you do in the lesson, where there's some gaps and the number of lines represents the number of letters in the gap. And then also that they need to read out loud, and this would then test their actual speaking knowledge. Are they making that sound spelling link effectively? And then finally, as part of this presentation, here is a suggestion of the phonemes that you could teach young people and the sequence. And they are really based on the high frequency of those phonemes. So the un is quite early on, because un is one of the most high frequency words in the French language, meaning or one. We've got the J sound, je, because it's there as part of je. We've got the silent letters and so on. And then some of the less frequent sounds come later on. So that is a suggestion when people ask me which one should I teach and when. I would suggest that there's not a right or wrong, but I would suggest you would have to create your own and know which order you're teaching them and have as part of your curriculum plan then which phonemes you're going to teach in French and in what order. So I just want to come out of my PowerPoint now. Those are some of my sort of details, and if you are interested in the Planet Phonic methodology, it's now, I used to sort of have it on a CD and post it out to people. It's now being put onto a website called speakeasy.net, which you can access some samples and have a go and try them. And they are also available for purchasing. I'm going to have a go at trying to show you this now. So I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint and have a go at sharing a different screen so we can have a look at there. Yeah, so on the Speakeasy website, we've got things like sample content you can have a look at. You can download some of the Planet Phonics activities. You'll be able to have a look at this webinar, which will be in the training section as soon as I finish this. And I really recommend trying it out, seeing what you think of it. There are other ways to do it. You could just take the particular phoneme and teach it. But the method of using it where it's very planned, the practice and the retrieval is in there and the progression is in there, does work really well. And by the end of year 7, when I've covered every single phoneme, and you don't need to do it every week, but if you take 15 minutes out of a lesson and then maybe review particular phonemes over time, if you're finding the students are forgetting them, you could take that whole lesson again. What I tend to find is that I can give year 7 students a whole paragraph to read and they'll read it accurately. They've learned the rules of pronunciation. And it's very important, I would say, to do this when students are in year 7, because you don't want them to get into bad habits and then to, once they've started pronouncing words wrongly in French, it's very hard to change those habits. So the time that you invest in year 7, that's sort of 10 to 15 minutes a week, if possible, is well worth it in the future. I don't know about you, but my experience of teaching a language is that if young people feel that they can speak it, they feel that they're being successful at it. If they can read and write it, but they can't actually have the confidence to speak it or think they can't speak it very well, they feel that they're rubbish at the language, because they know, and I think we do know as well, that the whole point of a language is ideally that you could go to a country and that you could actually speak the language and communicate with people there. And if you can do that, even if it's not perfect, I think that you have a lot more confidence in what you're trying to do. I'm just going to go on to the chat now because we've just got a few minutes left. And if anyone's got any questions, or if you just want to unmute yourself and ask any questions, I would love to hear from you, because the whole point about this, it's lovely to see someone from Los Angeles as well, actually, that's fantastic. But the whole point about these webinars is not that you're just listening to something that's been pre-recorded, but that you can actually interact a little bit. So please do ask any questions before we come to the end of our time together. I think we've just got a couple more minutes before we finish. And just to let you know as well that next week on Thursday, so that will be Thursday the 20th, I think, no, sorry, 22nd of September, I'm going to be doing a similar session in Spanish. And then the following Tuesday, which will be Tuesday the 27th of September, we're going to be doing one for German. So if you have colleagues who teach Spanish or German, then please do invite them to come along to this. So as we don't seem to have any questions, I'm going to finish this. And thank you very much for your comments, Sally. And that's great. So any other comments or thoughts in the chat? And if not, we are going to be coming to an end, and I wish you a lovely rest of your evening. We'll stop the recording now.